Meredith Hale had not yet fully grasped the shape of her new life when she walked back into her home after the funeral. The silence was unnerving. Her husband, Peter, had passed away just 6 days earlier after a brutal fight with a rare vascular condition that left them both drained, emotionally, physically, and financially. She had spent the last 3 months juggling hospice care, forms, bills, and fragile hope. There had been no time to prepare for grief. The funeral had been modest, understated, exactly as Peter had asked. Now that it was over and their children had returned to their respective routines, one back to college, the other to his quiet apartment downtown, Meredith was alone for the first time in years. The house, still filled with the scent of floral arrangements and sterilized medical equipment, no longer felt like hers. Everything around her echoed with absence, and the heaviness of it was something she couldn't quite put into words. She closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, letting her eyes scan the entryway she had walked through so many times before. That was when she noticed the paper, taped, rather sloppily, to the inside of the storm door. It wasn't in an envelope. It wasn't even folded. A single piece of heavy paper with a stamped seal at the top and 3 bolded lines in red ink. Notice of lien filing. Outstanding balance. Immediate attention required. Her stomach clenched with instinct before her mind could catch up. She peeled it off, read the first paragraph, and blinked. It didn't make sense. The document claimed that her property had an unpaid obligation of $19.10, categorized as a supplementary emergency fee, and as a result, a lien had been filed against her home by the neighborhood council. She frowned, reading the letter again more carefully, scanning for errors, some kind of misprint, a wrong address, or maybe a phishing attempt. But no. The parcel ID was hers, the lot number. Even her full name, listed formally as Meredith P. Hale, surviving owner. She hadn't missed a single scheduled payment. Not on her mortgage, not on her taxes, not on her regular maintenance fees. That much she knew. If Peter had missed something, it would have surfaced earlier. And $19.10? That wasn't even a full meal at the grocery store. Her hands began to tremble slightly. Not from fear, not yet, but from the overwhelming sense that something wasn't right, and the strange realization that this particular piece of paper, in its dry legalese and bureaucratic detachment, had the potential to be more disruptive than anything she'd dealt with in months of caretaking and quiet survival. She took it to the kitchen table, laying it flat beneath the morning light that streamed through the blinds. The seal at the top was real, issued by the county recorder's office. It included a registration date. The lien had been filed 3 days ago. That would have been the morning of the funeral, just hours before she stood graveside clutching a single red rose. She stared at that date, then at the signature from the filing department. The violation, it said, originated from the local neighborhood council, not a government agency but a semi-private managing body elected within the community. Meredith vaguely remembered seeing emails from them in the past, mostly about seasonal trash pickups, block parties, or parking enforcement updates. She didn't recall receiving anything urgent, let alone anything warning her of a debt or upcoming lien. Still in her black dress, with her heels discarded at the door and her hands beginning to ache from tension, she logged into her online banking account, opened her property fee records, and cross-checked every single payment going back 18 months. Nothing was missed, nothing delayed, nothing underpaid. The alleged charge of $19.10 simply didn't appear in any ledger. It wasn't just unfamiliar, it was invisible. That's what chilled her the most. She wasn't angry yet. That would come later. For now, it was a fog of disbelief, the kind that settles when you know something isn't fair, but the mechanism behind it is so impersonal and dry that you feel powerless just looking at it. She reached for her phone, intending to call the number on the notice, but found her hand drifting to the drawer instead, the one Peter used to call the home file station, where they kept all their official documents, contracts, tax returns, statements, Anything with a seal or signature. She pulled it open and began to sort, suddenly aware that she might need to arm herself with proof against something she didn't yet understand. The grief, which had only hours ago seemed like the largest thing in her life, now made room for something colder. Not louder, not sharper, but persistent. An anxiety she couldn't name. Meredith hadn't slept well. Even with the exhaustion of the funeral still hanging on her bones, her mind had churned restlessly through the night. She had tried to brush it off, told herself it was a clerical mistake, something easily reversible. Probably just a billing error that would be fixed with one phone call. But as she sat at the kitchen table the next morning, a second cup of coffee cooling beside the unopened laptop, the paper still lay there like a challenge. Her eyes kept returning to the details, the language, the formal structure that didn't feel accidental. The thought that someone had deliberately timed the filing for the morning of her husband's burial made her stomach twist. It felt personal, even though she knew it probably wasn't. Still, it suggested a level of detachment so mechanical that it veered into cruelty. She decided not to waste time with emails or hold music. Instead, she drove directly to the county office to speak with someone in person. The drive was quiet, the morning sun hitting the windshield like a glare she didn't have the energy to squint against. Downtown, the government building stood like it always had. Stoic, impersonal, painted in that sickly beige common to public institutions. She checked in at the front desk and was given a number, then sat beneath the humming fluorescent lights, watching the ticker creep forward in 5-minute increments. Her phone buzzed a few times. Condolences from a neighbor, a confirmation from the florist, a reminder about the hospice bed rental that needed to be picked up, but she ignored them all. Her number was finally called, and she approached the glass window where a woman in her late 50s with kind but tired eyes greeted her. Meredith explained her situation with a calmness she didn't entirely feel, laying the printed notice flat against the counter. The woman, whose nameplate read D. Newell, adjusted her glasses and leaned forward to read. She asked for an address and parcel number, then began typing slowly into her system. There was a long pause as her eyes scanned something on the screen. "Yes," she finally said. "The lien is valid on record as of August 2nd. Filed by the Sunset Valley Neighborhood Council. Cited reason, unpaid supplementary fee, listed as an emergency administrative surcharge, $19.10. "I've never received a bill for that," Meredith said, trying not to sound defensive. "Not an email, not a letter, not even a note taped to the door. Nothing until this notice." Newell nodded with a kind of practiced empathy that didn't quite reach her voice. "That's not something we can verify here. We only process what's filed. If the filing party affirms that the debt existed and that they sent appropriate notice, our role is to register it. Challenging it would require a formal objection." Meredith's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the counter. "You mean, even if they didn't actually notify me?" "It's assumed they did unless proven otherwise," Newell said, not unkindly. "That's why the dispute has to be handled through a separate filing. Unfortunately, we don't mediate that here. You'd have to initiate a lien challenge through the small claims court or through a property law attorney." It wasn't Newell's fault. Meredith could see that. But it was infuriating to know that something so consequential could hinge on such a narrow and flawed assumption. She thanked her and stepped away from the window, folding the paper and placing it back in her bag with more force than she intended. The line behind her hadn't moved much. The hall smelled faintly of processed air and floor wax. She left without looking back, walking toward her car as if the parking meter might demand something else she wasn't prepared to give. That afternoon, Meredith dug deeper. She began reviewing every email she had received over the last 2 months from the Neighborhood Council's automated service. There were some about recycling schedules, a reminder for a monthly yard inspection policy, and even one about a dog waste compliance campaign, but nothing with any mention of an emergency fee. She checked her spam folder. Nothing. Her mailbox had only held condolence cards and medical mailers lately. No invoices, no notices. Still, she combed through her bank statements once more, matching up each payment to the residential services department. Every charge was routine. There was no missed month, no bounced transaction. She printed everything out, circled the months, annotated the bank codes. If she was going to challenge this, she needed to be armed. And she knew from the way the woman at the county office had spoken that it wouldn't be as simple as pointing out a discrepancy. The next logical step was to speak directly to someone from the neighborhood council. Meredith hadn't interacted with them in any meaningful way since she and Peter bought the house 9 years ago. Most of the council communication was electronic, and, frankly, Peter had handled it. But now she searched for a phone number on their most recent flyer and called. The line rang 6 times before a voice answered. Sharp, professional, but almost suspicious. Sunset Valley Council Office. "Hi, my name is Meredith Hale," she began. "I'm calling about a lien notice I received yesterday. It's regarding a charge I wasn't notified about." "Yes," the voice interrupted. "Property on Echo Field Drive?" "Yes." "You're in the system. That lien was registered due to non-payment of the July emergency fee. It was approved during a special session in June. A notice was sent electronically to all property owners." "I didn't receive any such notice." "It was a part of the July 3rd digital bulletin. We don't send individual reminders for sub-fees unless they're overdue. Your balance was unpaid as of July 29th. The council moved forward with enforcement." Meredith felt her throat dry out. "But the amount is $19. There was a pause. "Correct. The council enforces all unpaid dues equally, regardless of the amount. That's in the charter." She clenched her jaw. "My husband died July 29th. I was at his funeral the day the lien was filed." "I'm sorry for your loss," the voice said flatly, with the rhythm of someone who had said those words too many times without meaning them. "But the process is automated. You'll need to file a formal challenge if you believe there's been an error." Meredith ended the call without another word. She sat at the dining table again, the documents scattered before her like evidence in a trial she hadn't agreed to attend. Her grief had barely had time to settle into shape before it was shoved aside by this surreal, infuriating, and utterly tone-deaf situation. It wasn't just the lien. It was the principle. The fact that she had been managing Peter's medications, organizing end-of-life paperwork, bathing him in the final weeks, and all the while, someone had quietly logged a $19 charge in an obscure bulletin and, without hesitation, moved to mark her. Home as delinquent. The numbness she had felt in the county office had now hardened into something sharper, controlled, cold anger. Not rage, not panic, but a steel-threaded refusal to be pushed around, especially not like this. If this was going to be a battle, they had no idea who they'd picked it with. The next morning, Meredith woke up earlier than usual. It wasn't because of any alarm or pressing task, but from the kind of tension that coils deep in your chest and doesn't let go until something is done about it. There was no denying it anymore. What had begun as a surreal annoyance was now a legal threat hanging over her home. And not just any home, but the one Peter had helped renovate with his own hands, the one they had bought when their kids were still in high school, the one where every corner carried the sound of their life together. She dressed in something formal enough to signal seriousness but unthreatening, packed her folder of documents and printed records, and drove to the address listed for the neighborhood council's physical office. It was located in a commercial plaza on the edge of town, tucked between a dental practice and a tax preparation service. From the outside, the office looked more like a rented unit than an official headquarters. No flag, no receptionist desk, just a frosted glass door with a metal plaque that read Sunset Valley Community Council. She hesitated for a moment before knocking. When no one answered, she turned the handle. The door opened to a modest lobby with 2 chairs and a closed inner office door. A thin woman in her early 40s stepped out, holding a tablet in one hand and a reusable coffee cup in the other. Her blazer was buttoned too tightly, and her expression was the kind that didn't invite familiarity. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, already sounding as though she'd prefer not to. "My name is Meredith Hale. I received a lien notice on my property. I'd like to speak with someone about it." The woman's face didn't change. "Did you call the main office line?" "I did," Meredith replied, steady. "They told me I could file a challenge. I want to do that in person." "There's a form for that online," the woman said, already starting to turn away. "I'm here now," Meredith said, her voice gaining edge. "I'd rather not file a complaint into a digital void. I want to understand how this decision was made, and whether you even sent a notice." The woman looked at her more closely then, the gears turning. "One moment," she said curtly, and disappeared behind the door. Meredith remained standing, the folder pressed tightly to her chest. After a minute or two, the door opened again, and she was waved in. The office was smaller than expected. 2 desks, a filing cabinet, and a conference table that was really just a kitchen table with mismatched chairs. At the far end of the room sat a man who immediately stood when she entered. He had the kind of face that aged without softening. Short-cropped silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the polished presence of someone used to speaking without being challenged. He extended his hand. "Richard Sloane, acting chair of the council. I understand you have a concern about a lien?" Meredith shook his hand without smiling. "More than a concern. I believe it was filed in error, without proper notice, and I want it removed." Richard gestured toward a seat and waited until she sat before lowering himself across from her. "I've reviewed your file." The charge in question, $19.10, was an emergency administrative fee voted on in June and due by July 29th. Notices were distributed through our monthly bulletin on July 3rd. We did not receive your payment. "I was caring for my dying husband through July," she said evenly. "He passed away the very day you filed the lien. I never saw any bulletin, never received a notice, and no one followed up. Why would you escalate something that small so fast?" Richard folded his hands, elbows on the table, and gave her that precise mechanical patience that can feel more hostile than shouting. "The council enforces policy as written. It's not discretionary. All residents are expected to remain current on their obligations. I'm sorry for your personal loss, but the lien process is automatic once an account becomes delinquent." "It wasn't delinquent," Meredith snapped, unable to hold it anymore. "I have every payment logged, every charge covered. You added that fee without any clear individual notice and then treated it like it was some major offense. Emergency fees are outlined in the bylaws," he said smoothly. "Our attorney has reviewed the procedure. You can challenge the notice through small claims if you choose." "I'm not going to sue my own neighborhood," she said, then paused. "But I will contest it through the county. And if this was part of some larger effort to push me out of my home, I promise you, I will make it very difficult for you." That was the moment his smile changed, just slightly. A hint of weariness passed over his face, not quite annoyance, not quite threat. It was the look of someone who expected compliance and now saw that he might not get it. "I can't offer more than the process allows," he said, finally standing. Meredith stood too, her pulse steady now, not racing. "You already offered enough. I see how this works. You count on people being too tired or too grieving to fight, but I'm not going to let this slide." She left the office without shaking hands, stepping back into the daylight that suddenly felt harsher. On the drive home, she began to notice things she hadn't paid attention to before. A "for sale" sign had appeared 2 doors down, barely a week old. Another house, a few blocks over, still sat empty after its previous owner had moved out unexpectedly last spring. A neighbor who used to wave at her when walking his dog now avoided eye contact entirely. It wasn't a conspiracy. It was worse. It was a quiet system of pressure, legal but calculated, and she had just scratched the surface. By the time she pulled into her driveway, there was a yellow envelope stuck under her windshield wiper. Inside, a notice. Second reminder. Additional penalty applied. Total due, $67.10. The increase wasn't just arbitrary. It was punitive. It was meant to break her will. Meredith folded the paper slowly, placed it in her growing folder, and walked inside. She didn't cry. She didn't even swear. She made a sandwich, brewed tea, and sat at the table again, flipping through her notes, printing out the complaint forms. Her grief had been hijacked by a bureaucracy that had mistaken her silence for weakness. They had no idea how wrong they were. Meredith hadn't expected anyone to help. After weeks of being shuffled between sterile offices, listening to impersonal explanations from people who hid behind process and policy, she had adjusted her expectations to near zero. That was why she was caught off guard when she received a call, not from an automated system or a cold front desk, but from a woman with a steady voice and a quick mind who introduced herself as Natalie Groves. "I was forwarded your inquiry by someone in my firm. You've been trying to contest a lien?" Meredith had almost dismissed it as another dead end, but Natalie spoke with a quiet confidence, and within a few minutes Meredith realized she was one of the rare ones who listened first and spoke only when. She understood the weight of what was being said. By the end of the call, they had scheduled a meeting. Natalie's office was small but sharply organized, tucked into a row of units near the municipal courthouse. She was a paralegal, not a lawyer, but she specialized in procedural challenges. Exactly the kind of loophole-spotting work that Meredith needed. She didn't promise miracles or offer dramatic speeches. She simply spread out Meredith's stack of documents and started asking the right questions. Where exactly was the emergency fee announced? Was there a board vote recorded in minutes? Do they have a record of individual delivery of notice to your property? Meredith had printed everything: emails, bulletins, payment records, and Natalie went through them line by line, highlighting inconsistencies. There it was. The emergency fee was buried in paragraph 6 of a 5-page neighborhood bulletin that also talked about 4th of July picnic restrictions. It had no bolding, no subject header, nothing to indicate that it carried financial consequence. Moreover, the PDF version online had been updated after the fact, time-stamped a week later than the council claimed it was originally posted. "That's what we call procedural camouflage," Natalie said, tapping the paper with a pen. "They want it to be technically legal, but practically invisible. That makes it exploitable." Meredith leaned forward, adrenaline starting to edge into her system for the first time in days. "Can we challenge it?" "Yes," Natalie said simply. "But we're going to do better than that. We're going to expose the pattern." She explained that there were provisions in the state's property code that allowed for lien removal if it could be demonstrated that notification was intentionally obfuscated or selectively enforced. Even better, if they could show a trend, multiple homes being targeted with the same tactic, particularly ones where the owners were going through personal hardship, then they could escalate it to an ethics review panel for community governance abuse. Over the next week, Meredith and Natalie worked quietly, methodically, building their case. Meredith, despite not being a legal expert, became fluent in the language of bylaws and filing procedures. She tracked down 2 former neighbors who had sold their homes suddenly in the past year. One had been dealing with a divorce, the other had lost a parent. Both admitted to receiving similar notices with minor fees that ballooned quickly and made them fear legal trouble. Neither had challenged it. They had just paid, or sold, or walked away. One of them handed over an old envelope with a scribbled post-it still stuck inside. "Don't let this get out of hand. You'll never win." It had been left anonymously in their mailbox after the second penalty arrived. Meredith also paid a visit to the local records office and requested public filings on neighborhood property transfers. What she found unsettled her more than she expected. 3 homes had been transferred to the same private holding company, all within 6 months of lien activity initiated by the same neighborhood council. The company wasn't based in state. It operated out of a business park with no real office, just a mailing address. On paper, it all looked above board, but the pattern was becoming clearer. Create artificial debt, enforce harsh penalties, apply legal pressure, and when the property owner breaks, buy low through a third-party proxy. It wasn't illegal, not in the traditional sense, but it reeked of strategic dispossession. Natalie confirmed as much when she reviewed the list. "This is targeted extraction," she said, "and it's hard to fight because technically they're not breaking the law. They're just manipulating the gray areas around it. But if we document the pattern and establish an intent to deceive, we might have leverage." The final push came unexpectedly. One evening, while reviewing scanned copies of old bulletins from the council's online archive, Meredith noticed something strange. The file name of the July bulletin was different from the previous versions, not just in format, but in structure. She dug deeper, opening the file's metadata. The bulletin had been edited on July 12th, almost 10 days after the supposed vote. The section outlining the emergency fee had been added later and backdated to look original. She showed it to Natalie, who smiled with grim satisfaction. "This is what we needed. Fabricated notice, retroactively inserted. That's grounds for removal." Armed with this, Natalie filed a formal motion with the county to challenge the lien, attaching copies of metadata records, testimony from 2 other residents, and a timeline showing Meredith's documented payments and Peter's death certificate as evidence of undue hardship during the period in question. They weren't just fighting a fee now. They were spotlighting a system that had been quietly exploiting its residents under the guise of self-governance. The challenge was accepted for review, and the lien was frozen pending investigation. The neighborhood council was given 10 days to respond. Meredith didn't celebrate, not yet. But she felt something shift. Not hope exactly, but resolve. Harder, more useful. She knew this wasn't over. She hadn't yet faced what retaliation might come from standing up to the machinery behind the notices and penalties, but for the first time in weeks, she wasn't just reacting. She was positioning. She was building. And she wasn't alone. The lie wasn't just in the fine print. It was in the assumption that no one would ever bother to read it. The response from the council arrived faster than Meredith expected. A 3-page document printed on official letterhead, filled with cold language and vague deflections. They didn't deny the existence of the emergency fee or its belated visibility. Instead, they leaned on legal nuance. The council is not obligated to provide individualized notice of procedural votes enacted under emergency provisions. They also stated that all documentation was made accessible to residents in accordance with standard policy, sidestepping the clear implication that the documents had been altered after the fact. More than anything, the tone of the letter wasn't defensive. It was dismissive, as if they were confident that their formality alone would be enough to make the problem disappear. Meredith forwarded it to Natalie, who responded with a single line, "They're betting you'll fold." But Meredith had no intention of folding. Not now. Not after the sleepless nights, the legal research, the strange looks from neighbors who no longer waved, and the quiet understanding that her very presence on that street now marked her as a threat to something they'd rather keep in the shadows. The tension didn't take long to escalate. Within days of the council's formal reply, Meredith received another envelope. This one hand-delivered and unsigned. It wasn't from the county, nor did it bear any return address. Inside was a notice of community non-compliance. The phrasing was ambiguous but clearly intended to intimidate. Your recent conduct has drawn concern regarding your alignment with established neighborhood values. It wasn't about the lien anymore. It was about control. Someone wanted her quiet, compliant, gone. That same evening, a streetlight directly outside her house flickered out. The next morning, her garbage bins, usually collected without issue, were left standing in the middle of her driveway, lids ajar, contents slightly spilled as if to send a message without ever saying a word. Meredith wasn't paranoid. She didn't think some secret army was surveilling her, but she knew when systems turned subtle and targeted. These weren't coincidences. They were signals, petty, silent warnings designed to wear her down. Natalie agreed, cautioning her to document everything. So she did. Every notice, every interaction, every deviation from the norm. She kept a folder on her kitchen table, thickening by the day. Things shifted again the following week when Natalie's office received a formal summons. The neighborhood council was filing a counter-motion alleging that Meredith's challenge constituted malicious obstruction of community order, a term so vague it felt invented. The implication was clear. They were trying to intimidate her into silence by turning the legal system against her. The counter-motion had no legal teeth. It was more of a procedural tantrum than a legitimate claim, but it would still require a response, more paperwork, and more time. And, crucially, it was public. Once entered into court records, it would be accessible to anyone who knew how to look. Meredith's name would now be attached to a dispute with governing authority, a label that could make her appear unstable or litigious should she ever try to sell or refinance her home. It was calculated punishment through process, but they had misjudged her again. Because Meredith didn't shrink from it. She used it. The filing gave her access to discovery. Through Natalie's help, they demanded access to past council meeting minutes, internal votes, communication logs, and copies of archived bulletins. The council resisted, predictably, and then delayed. But delays have a strange way of backfiring. While they dragged their feet, Meredith's informal network of former residents continued to grow. Another woman came forward, an elderly widow who had moved out 2 years earlier after receiving a special maintenance penalty for a broken fence gate. Another man, a single father, claimed he was targeted over a late recycling violation that tripled in fines after he questioned the process. It was a pattern, and Natalie began to organize it all into a cohesive brief. Then came the break neither of them expected. A clerk from a regional management firm, one of the property administration companies that rotated through neighborhoods like Sunset Valley, quietly reached out to Natalie. She didn't offer direct testimony, but she did share an anonymized document. An internal memo circulated within a past property management team that referenced selective enforcement strategies. While the wording was legalistic and careful, the meaning was undeniable. High-value homes with vulnerable owners, people who were widowed, recently divorced, financially distracted, were tagged for enhanced fee scrutiny. Not officially, not in writing with names, but through targeting language like monitor for non-responsiveness and elevated follow-up priority. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was smoke, and it pointed toward something organized, not incidental. Meredith read the memo 3 times that night. She thought about all the nights Peter had sat at this same table, eating late dinners after chemo, talking about the house and how proud he was they'd managed to keep it afloat through everything. She thought about how easily she could have paid the $19.10 just to make the noise stop, but then they would have won. Not because they'd collected the money, but because they'd successfully scared someone into submission again. She would not be another line in their spreadsheet. 2 days later, a car she didn't recognize parked across the street. It stayed there for 4 hours with tinted windows and the engine running. A neighbor finally approached and knocked on the window, only for the vehicle to drive off slowly without answering. The next morning, Meredith's mailbox door was hanging off its hinge. She didn't report it, not because she was afraid, but because she knew how these games worked. Whoever was behind this wasn't interested in confrontation. They wanted her exhausted, isolated, overwhelmed. But she was none of those things anymore. By the end of the week, Natalie had filed a new motion. a consolidated claim showing pattern abuse across 5 different homeowners. The court accepted the motion for preliminary hearing. A date was set. Now, there was no way for the council to bury it behind letters or fines. They would have to answer for everything in front of a judge, and, for the first time, it wasn't just Meredith in that fight. It was all of them. Every person who had been made to feel small, unreasonable, or alone. The quiet war was over. Now it would be heard aloud. The day of the hearing arrived beneath a heavy sky, the kind that threatened rain but never delivered it. Just pressure, thick and unmoving. Meredith stood outside the county courthouse with Natalie, their file boxes stacked neatly on a dolly beside them. Everything labeled, everything in order. Despite the gravity of what they were about to face, Meredith felt calm. Not because she believed the system would automatically side with her, but because she knew she had brought the truth, brick by brick, paper by paper. She hadn't come to be pitied or saved. She had come to hold someone accountable. Inside, the room was modest. Rows of pew-like benches, polished floors, a single flag in the corner. No cameras, no audience, just a judge with a neutral expression and a staff clerk taking notes. The neighborhood council sent their attorney, a well-groomed man in a tailored suit who introduced himself with forced civility, but didn't look either Natalie or Meredith in the eye. He brought 2 thick binders which he placed on the table like anchors, heavy with red tape and technicalities. The council chair, Richard Sloan, was also present, seated silently behind his representative, hands folded, jaw set. The judge opened with a request for clarity. Natalie stood, concise and precise, outlining their challenge. The original lien was filed without sufficient notice, based on a fee that was neither clearly communicated nor fairly enforced. She walked through the timeline, pointed to the altered metadata in the July bulletin, showed that the emergency fee had not existed in the original version and had been inserted retroactively. She presented witness statements from 5 former residents, documentation of similarly questionable enforcement patterns, and the internal memo referencing selective enforcement strategies. The judge listened, eyes occasionally narrowing but expression otherwise unreadable. When it was the council's turn, their attorney shifted to procedural rhetoric. He argued that the bulletin had been public, that all changes were within the council's rights, and that residents were responsible for remaining informed through official channels. He dismissed the metadata discrepancy as a clerical delay in uploading, not an intentional falsification. He called the memo hearsay from an anonymous source. He stated that the council had acted in good faith, enforcing its rules as written, but the more he talked, the thinner his justifications became. The judge began to question him, first gently, then directly. Why was the fee not itemized in any of the direct payment portals? Why were certain properties consistently selected for immediate lien action over minor sums? Why was the metadata discrepancy never addressed until now? Why had the council failed to produce original meeting minutes where the vote allegedly occurred? The turning point came when the judge asked Richard Sloan to speak directly. It was unusual, but deliberate. Sloan stood, adjusted his jacket, and responded with the same cold professionalism Meredith remembered from their first meeting. He insisted that all actions were legal, that the council operated within its mandate, and that any emotional interpretation of their process was unfortunate but irrelevant. That word, irrelevant, hung in the air like a dropped blade. When the judge turned to Meredith, she didn't give a speech. She didn't cry or tremble. She simply stated that she had paid every bill, that she had never once received individual notice about the fee, and that her husband had died on the very day the lien was filed. She said that she had not been given time to mourn before being treated like a delinquent. She said it quietly without raising her voice, but every word landed like a gavel. The courtroom didn't need drama. It needed truth. And it was finally hearing it. The ruling didn't come that day. It never does. But the tone had shifted unmistakably. The council's attorney was already quieter by the end. Sloane avoided her gaze when he passed. Outside, as Natalie loaded the boxes into her trunk, she said only, "That went better than I expected." Meredith nodded, her hands steady, her breath even. She didn't celebrate. Not yet. But she knew something essential had happened in that room, something irreversible. They had pulled the curtain back, and what stood behind it could not be unseen. The court's ruling came 2 weeks later, printed in clean black ink on a single sheet of legal paper that carried more weight than all the thick binders the council's attorney had brought to the hearing. The lien was voided. The court declared the fee improperly implemented, citing the lack of transparent notice, misleading documentation, and procedural inconsistencies. The council was ordered to issue a formal withdrawal of the lien with the county recorder's office, and to reimburse all administrative and legal costs incurred by the challenge. There were no grand penalties, no headlines, no arrests, just a clean reversal, sealed and final. But for Meredith, it was enough. It was a line in the sand that would remain long after the paperwork was archived. What followed was quieter but not less significant. Within a month, Richard Sloane stepped down from the council citing health concerns in a one-sentence email to residents. No one filled his role immediately. Several other board members didn't seek re-election. A review committee was proposed by a group of homeowners, people Meredith didn't even know by name before all this, who now nodded at her when they passed, held doors open a little longer, or left quiet thank-you notes in her mailbox. No one said it aloud, but everyone had seen what happened, and everyone understood it wasn't just about $19. Meredith didn't return to her old routine. Something in her had shifted. The grief was still there, shaped like Peter, quiet and constant, but now it shared space with something stronger, a clarity. She didn't become an activist or join the council or try to be anyone's leader. She just lived in her home, her name on the deed, her breath in its walls, with the quiet, earned knowledge that she had defended something real and won. Not loudly, not easily, but completely.